What's up, guys? In this video, I'm going to talk about the 5 most common pawn weaknesses in chess. But before I get into that, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more great chess videos. So pawn weaknesses are very, very important. Remember, chess is like war. If you want to attack your opponent, you attack them while they're weak, and then you go on to win the battle. So here, if you can take advantage of your opponent's weaknesses, you can really put them on the defensive mode, and then you can start overpowering them and going on to win the game. So the first example we're going to talk about is backwards pawns. So this pawn right here is the backwards pawn. It cannot get pushed because then it will capture. And the most common way to attack backwards pawns to win them is to double up on them. So here the best move order is actually first bishop h6, putting pressure here. Then we're going to go rook g3 and bring the other rook to g8, hitting g2. When we go rook g3, we threaten bishop takes pawn, and rook takes pawn here, because this rook will be pinning this pawn on g2. So the next example is this e6 pawn is a backwards pawn, because as long as we stop him from pushing, we can target this pawn. Now, a very common mistake I see with weaknesses is people try to attack them with their own pawns. So here, if you go d5, I can just take, and now I trade away my weakness, and now I don't have one. So never attack with a pawn unless he can't capture, because then you win something or something like that. So in this example, the way to attack this pawn would probably be queen d3, queen c4, rook e3, queen e2, or even bishop e5, knight takes, rook takes, and then just queen e3 and double up on e6. And then here, white should go on to hopefully win this endgame. All right, next example, the backwards pawn in this position is this pawn on e4, because if he pushes, we're going to take. So the other thing to remember with weaknesses is generally you have no rush. You have plenty of time to attack them. They're weaknesses because they're more permanent, they're more long-term. So here we're going to go queen e7, bring this rook to e8, eventually push f5 to put pressure on this. Remember, he can't take because then we'll take his queen, otherwise we won't push f5, and then we will go on to try to win this pawn. All right, so the next type of weakness we're going to talk about are double pawns. So double pawns are weak because generally they're pretty easy to target. For example, these two. These are double isolated pawns. We'll talk about isolated pawns a little bit later. So how do we attack these pawns? We can go knight g6 to attack this guy, bishop g4, put pressure on this knight to try to attack this pawn, and then even maybe castle queenside and bring the rook in. So each move we're trying to attack these pawns actively, aggressively, not moving backwards. Now another thing to remember is double pawns aren't always bad. Let's say, for example, this pawn was here. These pawns would be doubled, but they're all together, so they would be strong. So we'll look at some more examples. So here, the weakness here are these two pawns on g5. Now, a big mistake in this position is taking on e6, because you take here, he goes rook here, you get this pawn, but now he goes rook takes pawn, the position's really opening up, and black's going to have a lot of pressure against this king. So remember, there's no rush. So what do? We go knight f3, then we take on g5, then we try to take on e6, and we still have a very good grip over the position. Like, for example, if this pawn was like here or here, and these double pawns would not be so weak because they would be together with this pawn. All right, so next example, these double pawns. So these ones are definitely weak. So how do we attack them? We move forward. We go bishop d6. We go knight h5. And just like the other ones, if this pawn was here, these pawns would be double, but they'd be protected, and they're not necessarily weak. Okay, so next, after double pawns, we're going to talk about isolated pawns. Isolated pawns I see a lot because I play the French, so exchange French, sometimes advanced French, you'll see a lot of isolated pawns. So how do we attack isolated pawns? Just simple. We just keep moving forward, putting pressure on them, and then we go on to win them. So these two pawns are actually double isolated, like the examples we saw before. And we're going to go knight d7, knight b6, maybe get this bishop out, queen out, rook here, and then try to take this pawn. Remember, no rush. Take it when you can. Make sure you're moving forward and make sure you're always still making good moves and not moving backwards. All right, so next example is another isolated pawn. So this pawn, this is actually very important because if you do this, you win. If you don't, then you're probably going to go ahead and draw this endgame. So the weak pawn here is this e5 pawn. It's isolated because there are no pawns next to it that can support it. So whenever you see a loner like this, these are the isolated pawns. So the way to attack this here is simple. It's just bishop d8, bishop c7, and you're going to go on to win the e5 pawn. All right, so our last example of isolated pawns, this d4 pawn is weak. Now, we don't want to go c5 yet. We don't want to bring the rook here, because he's attacking our c6 pawn. So first what we do is we go rook d6, we go rook d8, we triple up on this pawn, and now here we go c5. And c5 is okay here because he cannot take, because then we'll take what's behind it. So rook d6, rook d8, and attack the isolated pawn. Remember, isolated pawns are always bad in the endgame, but better in the middle game because there's these open files. So when you play against this, you want to trade a lot of pieces. You want to go to the endgame faster, and then you can go ahead and win it, and then have a very nice endgame to proceed. All right, and the next example we're going to talk about are overpush pawns. These are pawns that are pushed too far, and for that reason they become a target. So pretty clear here in this example, this e3 pawn is overpushed. So here we would attack with knight g2, and it's got no support. It's got the bishop and the rook, but there's no pawn support. I mean, it's also isolated, and we can go ahead and scoop it up with knight g2 and bishop takes e3. So when you're playing the endgame, pushing pawns is very important, but make sure not to push them too fast and then end up losing them. Okay, so then the next example is the overpush pawn is this d5 pawn right here. This pawn is pushed too far. It's got already some attackers, and the way black can win it is just by going queen a5, attacking here, and then black's going to go ahead and overpower, get this pawn, and then just be up a clean pawn in the middle game. All right, now here, this one's a little bit more sneaky. The overpush pawn is going to be this pawn on h5. So this pawn, it looks okay, but the problem is we go bishop f7, and then we can really target it. He cannot take here because we take with check. And bishop f7, if he goes rook h1, now the rook is stuck guarding this pawn, and our rook can kind of more freely run around. Now, the last example that we're going to talk about, and this is something that's maybe a little bit new, maybe it doesn't really have an official name, but I want to call them soft pawns. So pawns that aren't quite backward pawns, aren't quite isolated pawns, but we can attack them. So here, for example, the soft pawn is d6. It's not quite backwards because maybe someday he can push on d5. But here what we're going to do is go bishop f4, put him in a line of fire or a pin, and this d6 pawn will become very weak, and eventually we're going to overpower it. We're almost going to treat it like a backwards pawn and go queen d2, rook d1. You'll see with these soft pawns, you see a lot of doubling. Now here, d6 looks very weak. It's a very, very strong backwards pawn. The problem is we double, he's just going to keep defending it, and we're not going to be able to overpower him. So here, the real soft pawn in this position is the g7 pawn. So here, what we can do is go queen g5 and rook g3, attacking this pawn. Remember, if this knight moves to protect this pawn, I mean, we also have checks, but we can also take this pawn. So everything falls apart with this one pawn in g7. So queen g5, rook g3, and target it. And the last example. So this one, the soft pawn. So we have a backwards pawn over here, and I guess we kind of have an isolated pawn over here because it's on the edge. And this is going to be the soft pawn here. So the way to attack it is rook a8, rook a7, and then like b5 with the line of fire, pinning the pawn and trying to win it. So these are the most common type of pawn weaknesses that you're going to see. It's very important to understand them and to be able to take advantage of them or to get rid of them if you have them. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys learned a lot about pawn structures and positional chess, and hope you guys were entertained.